So welcome everybody to the GLASSNET Thematic Seminar Series. Today we are talking about the global to local economics of land and water resources, current advances and future directions. And I know we're just at the top of the hour, so people may still be joining. So as you come on, you are invited to enter into the chat where you're joining from. We're always excited that these events just have fantastic global representation, and that's really fun to see. So my name is Danielle Grogan. I am a research assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire in the United States, and I'm a member of the GLASSNET leadership team. Um, just a few housekeeping items. As you might have seen, this event is being recorded, which means that you can also visit our website, which is at the bottom here later, and see the recording or share it with others who weren't able to make it today. I will give a brief overview of what GLASSNET is, in case you're new to this group, and what we are doing today. And I'll try to keep it brief because I know you're all here to hear from our fantastic speakers. Uh, let's see, is it going to advance? All right, so what is GLASSNET? I'll go back. You might have seen here, GLASS stands for the Global to Local to Global Analysis of System Sustainability. And the net part of it is that we are actually a network of networks, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. But more importantly, we are here because we recognize that meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals with limited land and water resources presents a significant challenge. And so GLASSNET as an organization aims to enable transformative scientific analysis that can facilitate decision making for sustainable development. We also want to develop diverse human capital. So we're investing a lot in training, in networking, in connecting, in learning from each other in this topic of sustainable development goals for land and water. And so to do this, we've formed a network of networks. Basically, this means that we've looked at who around the world is already doing this work. Often we end up in these groups locally, and we said, let's connect together. If there are groups working on this topic, we want to bring them all together and make sure we share. We want to connect across disciplines. So we have natural resource economists, we have hydrologists, we have agronomists, we have computer scientists. We want to bring all these people together. We also want to connect across the spatial scales of analysis. That is that global to local to global part. We also want to connect across temporal scales. Are we talking about the short term or the long run? Also, we are intentionally connecting these networks across national boundaries and connecting people across career stages to help with the networking in this field. And here you can see our current collection of networks. If you are part of a network that's not represented here and you think it would be a good fit, going to our website will also give you a way to contact us and potentially connect with us and join the effort. So what do we do to achieve these goals? There's lots of different activities across GLASSNET, such as workshops. We've had a whole bunch of different workshops. They're often virtual so that our scope, our span can be quite large, our reach can be large, as well as things like conferences and trainings, many of which are in person. Also publications and journals, special editions. So we'll highlight publications that are relevant and make sure that everyone in the network of networks hears about them. There's a fantastic journal collection recently on this very specific GLASS topic. We also have travel awards. If this is something you're interested in, you should check the website because we've been able to send early career scholars all around the world, as well as gathering community research tools and data. I'm not going to go through all of this now, but this is just an idea of how we connect and achieve our goals. So that's GLASSNET, but specifically today, we are thinking about land and water resources, in particular on the economics and conservation. And we have some fantastic speakers and discussants. So our agenda is first, we're going to hear 3 talks that will span groundwater and surface freshwater and land. And then after those talks, we have 2 structured discussions that are led by practitioners who are at that intersection of science, policy, and development. So they're going to talk about how they're using these new advances in science to inform decision making and policy. And then last, Carter Brandon of the World Resources Institute will be leading an open discussion and Q&A. We will have almost half an hour for that open discussion part, so we're really hoping for a vibrant discussion. We hope you've brought your questions. You're welcome to use the raise hand feature in Zoom if you'd like to speak your question on Zoom. However, if you prefer, you can type it into the chat and either Aman or I will read it at an appropriate time in the discussion. So please feel free to engage in the discussion in either way. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Aman Hadiki, who will be introducing the speakers in order.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good time. And my name is Iman Haqiqi. I'm a research economist at Purdue University. I'm really delighted to be among such a strong group here. So we have exceptional panel, as Daniel introduced already. We are going to start with Shan Zidema, who is a research assistant professor at University of New Hampshire. And he has done amazing work on hydrology and is bringing interdisciplinary perspective to how land and water interact. And we are going to hear from Shan about a special issue that he's going to talk about, what he learned about that. Shan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Aman. Thank you, everyone. Everybody can hear me well, I trust. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a focus issue in environmental research letters on groundwater and society, with a special focus on how groundwater can connect to land and water conservation issues. I'd like to point out that the top right corner of the screen I've left available for speaker window if you are on a single screen like I am. Okay, so I'm coming at the problem of groundwater in a very macro scale perspective. We do a lot of global groundwater modeling with a focus on really the human intersection of groundwater. Largely, the problems with groundwater depletion are human problems. So to be able to understand the physics is one thing, but to understand how humans interact with the physics of groundwater depletion is paramount. This is an example from our global estimates of drawdown from a very recent, very preliminary simulation that we're contributing to the ECMIP program, the new sector on groundwater. And also on the top, we have a few images from a recent publication where we looked at trying to decompose total water storage depletion in the IGB river basins in South Asia. And we're comparing our model results to GRACE to try to understand the relative impact of glacier melt and groundwater depletion in the region. So any of these problems with groundwater depletion here, we have to understand how people are interacting with these problems. And to that end, because we are not social scientists, we are hydrologists by training, we needed to get other expertise. So about 2 years ago, we put on a workshop we called Groundwater and Society at Penn State University. We convened 43 researchers from 17 institutions. We had 2 plenary keynotes, including one of our illustrious discussants today. We organized everybody into 5 topical sessions with the goals to really scope the current state of research at the intersections of hydrogeology and social sciences, identify the grand challenges in the space, and motivate the social questions that really drive groundwater research, and hopefully to spark new transdisciplinary collaborations. And then the outcome of this workshop led directly to a focus issue in environmental research letters entitled Focus on Groundwater and Society, Sustainably Managing an Invisible Resource. The QR code here is a link to the focus issue. We had 8 manuscripts started at the workshop, and in total we published 14 manuscripts, including 10 letters, 3 perspectives, and 1 review. I'd like to just take the next few minutes to highlight some of the great work from that focus issue that intersects with our theme today. First, we can look at global data and models. We have two contributions I'm going to highlight. Xander Huggins prepared the Global Open Access Groundwater Data Catalog. This is a topical review where he identified at least 144 data sets or data set groups that have some connection to groundwater-dependent socio-ecological systems at a global scale. He's indexed all the data sets based on the system that it references, everything from governance to climate, and how it relates to groundwater, whether or not it's an important aspect or it feeds into groundwater studies, or if groundwater data was used intrinsically in the development of the data set. That's all available at his GitHub IO page there. We also get a contribution from Robert Reinecke, where he compared 4 existing global groundwater models. He's found that there's quite a bit of dispersion, a lot of variability between the different modeling platforms that are available now, and this has significant consequences for how we incorporate models into our study. For instance, looking at just the forest cover area across the globe, about 30.5 million square kilometers, the different models predicted that anywhere between 5 to 20 million of those areas existed with shallow water tables that are important for ecosystems. That level of variability in the models makes it really difficult to have any confidence about how we might be able to project landscape evolution of these systems. So in addition to global focus, we also had many contributions that had much more local focus. We had studies from the La Mancha Oriental Aquifer in Spain, Central Valley Aquifer in California, as well as Sable Islands in the North Atlantic. But I'm going to focus on 2 studies here from Central and South America. Roger Madrigal Ballestero described asadas, which are local community associations that are responsible for water resource management across Costa Rica. These are a fundamentally local power system for governing water resources. And some of the things that they found were that there are fewer wellhead protections. There's less area conserved to protect wellheads than there are for surface water sourced asadas. And this has important implications for water quality that's been degraded throughout the country. He also found that there's a movement towards federations of these associations so that they can exchange expertise a little bit more fluidly, however, still retain a lot of the local autonomous control. Now, from Bolivia, Monica Guzman Rojo did a fantastic study where she looked at using remote sensing and simple models to map groundwater recharge and found abrupt changes and declines in groundwater recharge across the nation of Bolivia at the municipal level. There is a strong uptick in the rate of groundwater in declines around the early 2010s. And this coincided with 2 things: high episodes of fire incidents, as well as a series of policy shifts that led to more vigorous deforestation across the country. This data set and model is going to be useful for helping municipalities prioritize where forest conservation is going to be most effective for maintaining groundwater resources. A lot of the studies from the focus issue focused on global trade or trade and food production. So generally speaking, international markets prompt a lot of decision makings for local farmers. Groundwater availability at those farms constrains those productions. How production and irrigation moves is really based on a couple factors: market openness, but also as well as labor mobility. So there's consensus from multiple disciplines. This is from a summary from Megan Konar, that from both water footprints, econometrics, as well as equilibrium modeling, market openness tends to decrease both subnational and global groundwater depletion. We can look at this at the scale of entire countries and find the same result if we look at the interstate trade within the US. Conservation measures when they're paired with irrigation efficiency, Aman shows that hundreds of cubic kilometers of groundwater withdrawals could be offset by conservation measures and strict groundwater sustainability measures. This would, of course, result in dramatic shifts in production across the globe. All of this work is very critical for understanding how we manage these resources into the future. This is an image from the Hidden Wealth of Nations, a World Bank report from a few years ago that Isha prepared, Isha Zaveri. And there's a lot of important things to consider when we're looking at this urban to rural to urban pressure, development pressure. This has been one of the main focuses for us in motivating our work in groundwater resources. A lot of these areas where we have the highest intensity of rural to urban pressure are those exact same hotspots we see for groundwater depletion. So land and water conservation are going to be critical for managing a whole host of very negative outcomes and externalities for these types of transitions. In order to do that, we really need to have a very convergent and cross-disciplinary analysis, spanning scales that really centers all facets that are important here, including ecosystems, the hydroclimate, the market systems, governance structures, and the developmental needs of the communities. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. I'll put the QR code for our focus issue back on the slide here, and I'll pass it back to Aman.
Thank you, Shan. That was fascinating set of information. I hope we could discuss some of those later. People, if you have questions, please put it in the chat or feel free to hold it and ask it later. Next, as Shan is going to stop sharing and Jonathan is going to start sharing. So next is Jonathan Dolman, who is from PBL Netherlands. So I forgot the name. Okay, so you introduced the affiliation. Sorry, Jonathan. He's going to talk about land after we learned about groundwater. I think it's time to learn something about land data and how you are dealing with that. Please, Jonathan.
Yes, thank you so much, Iman. I'll first share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Right. So my name is Jonathan Dolman, Jonathan Dolman in Dutch, from the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. And I'll be talking about high-resolution land use data for agroeconomic modeling, which is a key topic that I work on at PBL. My specialty is land use in relation to climate change, but I also work a lot on relation to water use, pollution, and planetary boundaries, and those kind of topics. And specifically, also my connection to GLASSNET is my cooperation with the team of Iman and Tom Hurtel with the simple G model that I also talk a bit about. So I have three specific topics that I'll discuss. First, land use data for spatial explicit agroeconomic modeling. Then example from some more high resolution work we've done where we try to go from land use change data to conversion elasticities. And lastly, an introduction of another project where we work on land management, which may be an interesting way forward in the near future. So specifically for this project that I mentioned, I work with the team of Iman on the simple G model, which many of you may know, agroeconomic model linking the global to local to global back economic system. And my role in this cooperation is also to bring in information from spatial explicit databases and to try to leverage more the wealth of information that's out there and how to bring that in more detail into the Simple G model. Also based on my work with at PBL with the image integrated assessment model, which is also a model that represents the land use system in relatively high detail. So specifically what we've been doing here, still work in progress, but we recently started with a project that's now funded, where we also bring this further, where we bring in a specific representation of all the land use and land cover, and to link that to the economic system. And to do so, we are constructing a land use and land cover data set for the Simple G model, based on a number of of different data sources that I want to present here, also to give a bit of an impression of all the different data that's out there that can be used for this kind of exercises. And what we start off with is this ESA CCI data set. ESA is the European Space Agency, and CCI stands for Climate Change Initiative. And this is a very impressive data series that's been produced by ESA, obviously, which has high resolution land cover time series all the way from 1992 until a few years back, 2022. And it's at 300-meter resolution. So if you zoom in, you really see, for example, here in Brazil, the high resolution effect of what's happening with deforestation, for example. So there's a lot of information in these data sources. So this data set is then the basis on the land cover side of the data set that we're constructing to input into Simple G. And then secondly, we of course need information on agricultural data. For this, we built on the HIDE land use database produced by Klein Goldewijk et al., a former colleague of mine at PBL. And this is a long time series also of data. We have used the recent past only in this case, of course, but it has also again high resolution data for agricultural land use, specifically on irrigated versus rainfed cropland and grazing lands, split out into pastures and rangelands. And this is at 5 arc-minute resolution, so 9 by 9 kilometers. And this is a combination of satellite data, similar to the previous data source, but also lots of statistics, among others from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, but also various country-based data sources. This provides an overview of land use for agricultural purposes. Which is of course an important input also into an agroeconomic modeling. Subsequently, we're also using information on forestry. Specifically, we use this data source that was developed a few years ago by Lesiv et al., a group from IASA in Vienna. They work a lot with citizen-based science, so it's satellite-based, to be clear. So there's a lot of high-resolution data in there. It's 1 by 1 kilometer, but they combine this with large data bases with information on the ground of what kind of management is where, and they have this really interesting citizen-based system where they ask many people around the world to validate data series. So they produce this remote sensing based data set, and then they ask around the world to validate if the classification that they made in this remote sensing exercise, if that is correct, and then they can train the algorithm better to improve the analysis. So that's really impressive work based on combining satellite data and citizen-based science. And we use this information in combination with FAO statistics also to distinguish between managed and natural forests. And that's of course also really important to be able to say something on the forests that are used for producing timber or other products such as palm oil or plantation forests, and natural forests, which are not in use for humans. And then a third we combine these different data sources into one consistent data set at 5 arc-minute resolution. So it's this 9 by 9 kilometer resolution that I mentioned. And this gives us then, for each 5 arc-minute grid cell, we know exactly what land use and land cover is there, of course, under various assumptions. And then this is the stylized impression of the different categories that we then have, which is then managed grazing land, cropland, natural forest, other natural land, managed forests, ice and built-up area, and also a rest category called other anthropogenic land in this case, which is the rest because there's some mismatch between the FAO statistics and the total crop area. It's quite a substantial area which is also used by humans for other purposes. And then this data set is we are using that in Simple G, and Iman and I are now working hard to make this to make use of this information in economic analysis. And one key purpose of this is that we can keep track of land use and land cover, also, for example, to make the link to biodiversity. And that's why a next data set is also very important to include here, and that's information on protected areas. So for this, we make use of the World Database on Protected Areas, which can be which is open to see on protectedplanet.net. And this is a very impressive database on many of the protected areas around the world. And we use this in our analysis as well. For each protected area, it is actually shape information, so it's high resolution. And there's also information on how strictly protected different areas are. And what we then did with the data set that I just presented is we overlay this with this information on protected area, and we can see what kind of land use and land cover categories are protected or not. And typically you see that many of the protected areas are located so you see in total there's about 14% of land is protected around the world following the WDBA database. And many of these areas are on other natural lands and natural forests, and not so much as expected on built-up area, a little bit on cropland. But actually, large share is also on grazing land and managed forests. So you can see that still with these protected areas, there's quite some overlap on also areas that we, according to these different data sources that I presented earlier, are in use by humans. So that's an important thing to keep track of in our analyses, and that's something that we are now explicitly representing in the Simple G model, and that's the basis for our biodiversity impact assessments that we're now working on. But that's work in progress, so I'll hopefully in the next year, when our project is up to speed, we'll be able to present some more results on that. But this is just to give an impression of how we construct this database and what kind of data sources we're using there. And a second topic that I wanted to highlight here was how we can make use of this land use change information that I presented earlier from this ASA-CCI high resolution land cover data to try to make the step towards economic modeling specifically on land use conversion. So as I mentioned, this data series is a long-term time series, and this is, for example, the difference in deforestation, fairly shocking actually, from 92 to 2022 in Brazil, in the Amazon. But you can see here this data series has a lot of information about where conversions have taken place. And together with colleagues from Radboud University, we constructed an artificial neural network model where we use this high resolution data to estimate conversion potentials based on a range of different drivers. So we selected a large number of drivers. You can see them here on the right. They're related to climate, such as temperature, seasonality, precipitation, but also accessibility, distance to roads, previous land cover types, characteristics of the soil, and also topography. And then using this neural network model, we try to project or predict what the potential is of new locations for land use conversion for agricultural purposes. And based on that, we get these high resolution data series on locations throughout the world, and what the chance is basically that in case a new agricultural conversion will take place, where that will take place. So that's this data series. It can be it's publicly available. It's from colleagues from Cengiz et al. I think we can share the link maybe. And this is now a data series that we would like to also, that one of the ideas from this project that we now are working on is to include this potentially in the simple G model to inform land use change elasticity. So then we can use this high resolution data to also inform the patterns of land use change in our economic modeling. So that's quite exciting to try to make this link from remote sensing data to the economic modeling. But again, work in progress. So we'll see how this works out in the next 1 or 2 years. Lastly, I wanted to highlight a project that I'm working on together with colleagues from the EASA again and other institutes in the Netherlands and in Europe. It's Horizon Europe funded. It's called LAMASIS, Land Management for Sustainability, and specifically focused on sustainable land management for climate and biodiversity. And one really interesting result of this project is a big European database on land management, where we look much more into different characteristics of how land is used. Because the database that I presented before basically looks into agricultural land, and it's then either cropland or grazing land. But how this land is actually used is not clear in these types of data sets. And actually, it's very important. You can imagine biodiversity in low intensity grazing lands with only a few animals and quite a few trees has much more higher biodiversity value compared to a high intensity pasture, which is very intensely used. Similarly for carbon storage, also if a field is plowed regularly, that has much less potential for carbon storage in the soil compared to a more extensively used agricultural field. So this is actually a way of thinking that is gaining more traction now to try to distinguish more within agricultural land how land is used. And for this project, we constructed a land use management database. So this is unfortunately only for Europe, but it has a lot of information on subnational differences in land management and its impact. So it has differences in, for example, annual cropping versus perennial with trees, intensive versus extensive farming, natural forest versus highly intensively used plantation forests, etc. And all this information is then available in very high resolution. This is just a screenshot from northeastern Spain, Portugal. And now this is very many colors. It looks beautiful, but it's maybe a bit difficult to make sense of. But then, for example, if we look only at grazing land, you can see that the light colors in this case are very extensively managed grazing lands, whereas the darker purple colors are intensively used grazing lands. So there's a lot of spatial variation in there. And if we can bring that type of information also better into our models, in future projections, we can also see how some locations are actually stable at high intensity, for example, while others go from low intensity to high intensity or vice versa. And that's very important information on for the impact on biodiversity and carbon storage. So that's also a topic that we are looking more into. And this database is really nice to play around with. It's also available on the LAMASIS website. The link is in the PowerPoint. So yeah, those were the 3 topics that I wanted to present. Thanks for your time, and hopefully we can have some time for discussions later during this session.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you so much. It was fantastic. And for a long time, it was a barrier not having access to consistent data sets for grazing, cropland, forest, protected area, and suitable land. And this is great that you have worked on that. And yeah, if people have questions regarding Simple G, stay tuned. We can have discussion afterwards. Next, let's go to Mayura, and she is part of the Conservation International. I knew her from Friday. Actually, we had a talk together, and I was really impressed by amazing work that they are doing. Mayura, the floor is yours. Please go ahead. It went back to the presenter mode.
Sorry for the technical difficulties here. I was trying to unmute myself and couldn't. So thank you very much, Iman, for the introduction. As Iman said, I'm from Conservation International. I'm an eco-hydrologist, and also by training, I'm an agricultural engineer. And I will bring a little bit of the applied science that we do at Conservation International around fresh water. And what 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 we like to say in our group is that the motto of the freshwater science program that we have at CI is that freshwater is a solution space for climate and biodiversity crisis. So in other words, what we are doing, we are looking at freshwater conservation as central to solving both climate and biodiversity crisis. And to make this point, not only internally for our colleagues, but also externally, while at the same time attracting investments, we need to have numbers, especially numbers indicating that freshwater restoration is associated with significant carbon and biodiversity gains. If that is true, that's our hypothesis, organizations like CI and governments can tap into carbon and biodiversity finance to restore freshwater ecosystems while recovering several benefits at the same time to maximize return of investment. So what I'm going to present today is the first step that our team is taking in that direction. So very important and fundamental to the work that I'm going to present here, which is a research that just recently was published, is the Freshwater Challenge. But what is the Freshwater Challenge? So the Freshwater Challenge is the largest freshwater initiative in history. And we have these three main goals, to restore 300,000 kilometers of degraded rivers, 350 million hectares of degraded wetlands while protecting intact freshwater ecosystems. Right now, we have more than 50 countries that have committed to the Freshwater Challenge together with the EU, and this initiative was launched in 2023. But to deliver on the freshwater challenge, countries need to obviously restore and protect freshwater ecosystems. But in order to do that, they need to set their specific targets. So what we are asking countries is to define quantitative and geographically specific freshwater restoration targets and protection targets that are also aligned with the other commitments that they have with the other global targets, for example, the UNCCD, land neutrality, CBD, biodiversity conservation, and of course, the Climate Convention. So in response to that, we, together with NASA, my team together with NASA, we set ourselves to create this global map of high-value freshwater ecosystems, and I'm going to explain that in a second. And we created that map at the global scale so countries can have at hand a very simple data set to look into how to prioritize restoration and protection of freshwater ecosystems. This was our first objective. The second objective was to understand the extent to which restoring freshwater ecosystems could deliver climate mitigation and adaptation gains. I will focus only on the climate mitigation part of the story. And I want to spare you from the suspense here and give you the main results that this paper has brought. I forgot to mention it was published in January in Nature Water. So we were able to map a high resolution we have a high resolution analysis. We produced this global map of high value freshwater ecosystems that is 30-meter resolution, and we are encompassing a construct that incorporates aquatic and the terrestrial part of freshwater ecosystems, and I'm going to explain that in a bit. It's a very extent area that this layer is depicting. It's about 51 meters square kilometers. So we are highlighting opportunities for restoration and protection of the services that we care about. And then we were able to quantify the mitigation potential of restoring the degraded part of these freshwater ecosystems. So moving a little bit into the methods that we used, as I said, it was a combination of two different types of data sets. But before that, I need to mention that we adapted the high conservation value framework to support a more strategically and actionable approach to identifying freshwater ecosystems that are in need of conservation. By conservation, I mean restoration and protection. So our high-value freshwater ecosystem layer extend beyond conventional freshwater definitions and integrates the aquatic part and the adjacent terrestrial ecosystem. So the first data sets that we use are the usual suspects, right? So are the mappable attributes of freshwater ecosystems, including these layers here, rivers, lakes, and you can see the source of the layer as well as the wetlands. But then we added this terrestrial construct that that are parameter-driven units in adjacent terrestrial ecosystems based on science and policy. So for these, we incorporate three different types of construct, which are fixed with buffers, geomorphic floodplains, and headwater regions. I'm not going to be able to explain the rationale behind right now, but I will take questions later. And by combining this data sources, we assume that we are representing the disproportionate influence of freshwater ecosystems on global water flow, infiltration, storage, nutrient and carbon dynamics, as well as the importance of freshwater ecosystems for biodiversity refugia. We mapped high-value freshwater ecosystems in two different scenarios. So the first scenario represents a conservative scenario, which is the minimum scenario. And you were seeing a closer look of one specific region in the globe. The minimal scenarios include surface water bodies, wetlands, headwater regions fixed with riparian corridors along low order and high order streams. And the benefits that this minimal scenario represents is water quality, reduction of erosion, and maintenance of aquatic habitats. And we do have the maximum scenario here that includes all those categories of aquatics and terrestrial constructs, but it also incorporates the geomorphic floodplains and wetland corridors. So we are extending the definition further to broaden the hydrological zones that are really important to determine the health of freshwater ecosystems. So by extending the delineation, we are now incorporating aspects of flood mitigation, sediment retention, water storage capacity, as well as enhancing the representation of the ecological role that floodplains have for the entire functioning of the river network. So this is the actual representation. Of course, it doesn't say much, just to look at this map, this beautiful map here, but what we are highlighting here are the different categories that we have. You can see that the largest extent is of surface water buffer, as well as with floodplain here. And Russia Federation is the largest area. We have Canada, the US, China, and Australia having the largest cover of high-value freshwater ecosystems. So then the second step that we took was to quantify the climate mitigation potential of restoring the headwaters and riparian forests. So what we did was we look into the within the high-value freshwater ecosystems layer, how much of the forest, the natural forest, was degraded. And we, in these ecosystems, the floodplains, the fixed width corridors, and the headwaters, and we determined how much was degraded so that we could apply a carbon sequestration curve, because it's available for the entire globe, to determine how much carbon gains we could get out of restoring freshwater benefits and start stacking different benefits if we were to restore, if we were to focus the restoration and protection on freshwater ecosystems. So what we found is that is shown here on this two maps representing the annual CO2 removal potential across the top 50 countries for the minimum and the maximum scenarios. You can see that some countries are popping up as very important places for us to restore and have significant impact on not only freshwater, but also carbon. But of course, these numbers don't mean much if you don't put them into context. So the beauty, I think, of this work is that we were able to provide a strong argument on the importance of freshwater ecosystems as a climate mitigation solution. So we found that restoring high-value freshwater ecosystems could provide from 1 to 3.4 gigatons of CO2 per year across the two scenarios. And that number, if you were to put into perspective, means that if we are aiming at reaching zero CO2 emissions by 2050, that requires linear removal of CO2 from the atmosphere by 1.4 gigatons of CO2 per year. So, but with the numbers that we got for the climate mitigation potential from restoring high-value freshwater ecosystems, we could be providing a significant amount of the mitigation potential that we need. For some takeaways of this presentation, so we believe that the high-value freshwater ecosystem layer that we have developed is a comprehensive layer because it highlights ecologically meaningful areas that could be prioritized for conservation and restoration, and really can take countries that have committed to the freshwater challenge to the next level in terms of determining their targets. This layer also provides some foundation to start stacking different benefits, in this case, carbon and freshwater benefits, so that the countries can start aligning the delivery of their commitments around specific areas in their countries. And again, the mitigation potential gain from restoring freshwater ecosystems is high. So we now have this argument of bringing carbon finance to restore freshwater ecosystems. And finally, by the time that we did this research, half of the climate mitigation potential that we have calculated could come from half of it could come from those countries that have committed already to the freshwater challenge. So if we were able to give this message across, I think we have a good chance to use these different finance mechanisms that we exist for conservation and target them to freshwater ecosystems. So with that, thank you so much, and I'll take questions later.
Thanks a lot, Mayra. That was amazing. I really like the way that you connected freshwater ecosystem to carbon and then probably biodiversity financing. That is amazing. Now we heard a lot about groundwater and also land and freshwater ecosystem. I like to invite Alina Munir to talk about what did you learn from all of these amazing talks, and tell us more.
Thank you very much, Iman, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I think that it was a great opportunity for me to listen to all the speakers. So indeed, it connects a lot to our work in Fable. So just as a reminder for people who do not know Fable, we are trying to develop modeling tools for food and land systems and to have a quantitative pathway by 2050 to see how countries could transform their systems to more sustainability. And I just wanted to highlight that recently also there were new countries joining and also more discussion about the importance of water. So for several countries now and members of Fable, like water is really critical. So it was really a big call on us to improve the representation of water in our pathway. So super interesting to see already what exists. I just want to highlight maybe a few points based on these discussions. First of all, to acknowledge that EasyMIP is a great portal and a great initiative that allow indeed like to have so much of these results on water and also agriculture, climate, like made available. So I think in terms of open science and so on, like they are really like show the way. And so for initiative like us, but I think more people also working at country level, these are really a good amount of resources. However, like this is challenging for still many people to use now this data. So the data is there, but there are still like computing challenges. Usually there are really large data sets, require large computing also power to kind of process like sometimes daily or monthly, data resolution for several years and so on, several climate scenarios and so on. So here we see like, for example, also our members in countries sometimes struggle with that. So trying to find, and I know that GLASSNET is working also on that. So just highlighting that these are really efforts that go into the right direction to see like how to make this more used in countries. So this is one thing, and we're also working on that in Fable. Then also maybe another point of discussion is more about sustainability constraint. So indeed, like I think that this presentation have shown that there is water stress is a big issue, and that irrigation expansion in the past occurred in many places where there was already a problem of water depletion. So the question also that we had with experts from Fable Consortium was some of them were very strong on we need to kind of include this sustainability constraint, especially for preserving environmental flows in rivers, as really a strong constraint. We cannot use more water for irrigation than that. And some others said it's highly unrealistic. So if we want to say something meaningful about the evolution of irrigation and water needs and water withdrawals in the future, we cannot put these constraints. And it's up to each country to decide a bit on what is a reasonable constraint for them. And so I would be very interested to hear more about the experts who talked today about what is their view and maybe their discussions at country level with decision makers about what can convince them about like applying more, stringent constraints on water use. So this is something I think that I would be really interested to know. And indeed, maybe another part related to water is about climate change, so future climate change. And I think that in the past, or at least several experts also said that we tended to underestimate the impact of climate change on water availability or water risks. And so indeed, like this expansion of irrigation, it's still seen in many countries as the key lever to increase productivity. And in the context of climate change, I guess that it might be even more true that we need more irrigated land. And at the same time, the viability of this irrigated land may be threatened because it can turn more to salination or like the water availability even for irrigation may be reduced. So have you thought about that? Can you point to kind of relevant also literature on that? So I think that's already quite a bit. Maybe just clarification for our speakers. I was not sure, Mayra, when you presented your maps, like between your minimum and maximum, what were the key determinants that have played out to kind of determine this range and why some practices are included into the minimum and some others were not. So this is just a clarification question. And maybe also for Jonathan, for the Lamassus project, you showed that there is this very detailed land management map coming for Europe. This is super exciting for modeling, of course, and also I think you mentioned that you want to use it for your models. But do you see also other applications of this kind of data set? Is there other requests for decision makers to kind of make use of that? And if you can point to some examples, that would be wonderful. And maybe last, for the first speaker, is more about like the fact that you said that for openness, like it means that more trade, or this is the way I understood it, would mean that it leads to more sustainable use of water, or is it like something that I rightly understood? And because this was I think you said market openness decreases subnational and global groundwater depletion. This was something a bit surprising to me because I always tend to think that international trade kind of increase so much the demand maybe for kind of resources which are, produced very locally, but then the pressure on water would be much more than if you would not have trade. So I was just curious about it, but maybe just that I need to read the paper about that. But thank you very much, and I will stop here.
Thanks, Arina. That was great. I really like the way that you asked the questions at the end for everybody. I think I see Keith was here. He had worked a lot on productivity, so probably in case you want to add something in text later, or you want to talk regarding productivity and irrigation under climate change, that would be amazing. Before that, let's go to Isha Zaveri. She's from the World Bank, and she had done amazing work on water resources and economics of that. And what are your thoughts, Isha, on all of these land and water topics that we had discussed so far?
Thanks very much, Imam, and thank you so much to Danielle, as well as to you for the invitation. These were three incredibly rich and thought-provoking presentations. What struck me most is that although the entry points were quite different, right, from groundwater to freshwater ecosystems and land use data for modeling, they all converged on one broader message that water policy is really landscape policy, or perhaps even more strongly, that land policy is endogenous to climate and water policy. And I think that is very much in line with the spirit of GLASSNET, connecting land and water across scales and through a science policy development lens. And it's also incredibly fitting because this weekend we actually marked two days, the International Day of Forests and World Water Day. So we're talking about two deeply connected themes here. So a few reflections on the presentations. First, I thought, Mayra's presentation showed very powerfully how to make freshwater policy spatially actionable. I think that, the emphasis on defining quantitative geographically specific restoration protection targets is extremely important because this is often where otherwise compelling ideas fail to translate into policy. And the mapping of these high value freshwater ecosystems, so this is headwaters, the riparian areas, and the floodplains, sort of expands the policy lens beyond rivers and lakes alone, and pays broader attention to the terrestrial systems that sustain water flow, storage, and filtration. Second, Shan's presentation was very useful in broadening groundwater from a biophysical stock to the socio-ecological system that we know it's part of. And I really appreciated the emphasis on governance and the local institutions, the trade, the labor mobility, and also the uncertainty that plagues some of these underlying models. And we know that, in the policy world that I inhabit, groundwater outcomes are never only about hydrogeology. They're shaped by incentives, institutions, and land use change. And so a lot of the research you showed talked about that. I was especially struck by one of the findings from one of the papers that you spoke of, that deforestation and fire incidents are associated with declining recharge in Bolivia, because I think it speaks directly to this land-water link that is still underappreciated in many groundwater discussions. And finally, Jonathan's presentation made an important point about representation. Of course, distinguishing between irrigated and rain-fed systems is important, but also the importance of recognizing that forests are not a monolith, So how do we actually manage forests that are very different from natural forests? These distinctions matter so much because this matters in how we think about trade-offs among food production, biodiversity, carbon, and I would add water. Because if these land use categories are very coarse, then a lot of the policy conclusions that we come up with can also be very coarse. So from the perspective of my own work on forests and water, all of these talks resonate extremely strongly. At the World Bank, we recently put out our flagship report, Reboot Development, The Economics of a Livable Planet, which really showed this growing recognition that economic development cannot be sustained without safeguarding the ecosystems that support it. And we really put a spotlight on how environmental degradation of land, air, and water, it's not a second-order concern. It is transforming the very logic of development in many of the client countries where we work, in the low and middle-income countries. And because so many of these stresses, they co-occur, it's also important to recognize that addressing one environmental problem in isolation can also produce limited benefits or even unintended consequences elsewhere if interventions are not carefully designed. So I wanted to point out, one of the links that we looked at very closely in the report and in our recent work, where we paid particular attention to the links between forests and water, which resonate with a lot of the presentations that I saw today. One is that, forests and vegetation, they contribute about 45% of rainfall on land through moisture recycling. And once the rain falls, roughly 2/3 of it becomes green water stored in soils and vegetation in the root zone. And while only about 1/3 becomes, the blue water we more routinely manage and think of. And this hidden reservoir of soil moisture is vastly neglected in decision-making, even as it sustains nearly 75% of global food production. And it fuels the transpiration that generates the next round of rain. And so in the work that we did, we really wanted to provide an economic lens to these interactions and why this matters. And so we estimated that without a lot of these upstream forests or upwind forests that could sustain soil moisture and buffer economies from drought, losses in much of the developing world, these are in the low and middle income countries, could be very large. And so this points to the fact that, forests not just sequester carbon, they're not just biodiversity havens, they're also engines of the water cycle. And so these land-water interactions, they really matter, as we found for agricultural productivity, but also for hydropower generation and for broader economic resilience. And so I think that's why, all these three talks really felt connected to me. I think Myra's work, expands this freshwater frame to include the terrestrial interface, which is exactly where many of these regulating services are generated. Shan's work suggests that groundwater resilience depends not only on pumping and recharge in a narrow sense, but also on landscape condition, governance, and upstream ecological change. And Jonathan's work reminded me that, reminds us all that not all vegetation and not all restoration is equal. And in fact, even in our own work as well, we find that native and biodiverse forests are much more effective than monoculture plantations at retaining soil moisture and buffering drought. And these distinctions in land management are really, really important to make because they fundamentally alter or shape the hydrological and economic implications for downstream and downwind communities. One research frontier that struck me while listening to this is the potential to connect the land use modeling more explicitly with such interactions that I'm mentioning, because research has found that agricultural areas in 155 countries depend on forests in other countries for up to 40% of their rain. And so if these conversion elasticities were coupled with, for example, these moisture recycling ratios, we could begin to model not just how much forest becomes farmland, for example, but what that conversion costs the farmer downwind or the farmer downstream. And so I feel like this is exactly the kind of global to local to global question that the GLASSNET community is well placed to take on. I think for me, the policy takeaway is really that, we still tend to govern land, water, forests, and agriculture in separate boxes, while the underlying system, as we all know, does not operate that way. And the fragmentation in terms of the economic implications can be really costly. And for developing countries that lack the fiscal capacity for costly infrastructure, I think making the case for protecting, conserving, and restoring forests and landscapes, it really offers a vital, cost-effective alternative. And so how do we talk about these types of interactions in that way, I think is really important for decision makers. I think another entry point is really to also emphasize that these ecosystem services directly underpin livelihoods and create jobs. A lot of these ecosystem activities, they're very high labor intensive, such as forestry and landscape restoration. And at the same time, they can restore the natural capital on which long-term growth depends. But I think there's a cautionary tale there, which is restoration done poorly can also backfire. And so what and where you plant matters extremely. And here, practical institutional design is therefore very crucial for real-world adoption, because making this work will ultimately require policy instruments, payments for ecosystem services to results-based restoration finance. And similarly, how do we help developing countries invest in nature-based solutions will also mean requiring addressing deeper structural barriers. And this includes competing land pressures, includes governance, as well as poverty. But I think it first begins with recognizing that all of these things are interlinked, forest, soil, water, they work in concert with each other. And I think in the policy world, these links have been under-recognized and undervalued. And the economic evidence is increasingly suggesting that this can no longer be the case. So, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Isha. I believe that you and Elena both mentioned that international trade and economics are very important and probably less addressed. And these are actually clear future directions. Okay, Carter.
Thanks very much. I agree. It was a wonderful set of talks on waterland and biodiversity, etc. So I'd like to, Danielle, in your opening, you said we would sort of maybe address some of the questions, the technical questions that have popped up. Maybe we could just spend a few minutes on that. And then I'd like to turn to the overall goals of this session, which were to look forward. I mean, this is such an opportunity to have everybody around the table together to look forward on what are good approaches, what are some gaps, why are these gaps important, and then last, maybe some priorities for future research. And I must say, I have a World Bank background, so no surprise, I agree very much with what Isha just said, but to look beyond the physical hydrology, land use, carbon, to the policy world is super important. I think GLASSNET is very oriented around, it should be oriented around the policy openings and applications of the technical work it does. And then also, what are the global, local opportunities? I think we all know so much what are the global policy debates over climate. I mean, the major COPs every year, everything about, pricing and targets and finance, etc. But what are the global actions that relate perhaps more to land and water? And then how do we take those down? Of course, Myra's initiative, the Freshwater Challenge, takes those right down to the country level. And then Sean's presentations take it down right down to the local level. So what can this group think about in terms of going from some of this global analysis down to local? But Danielle, maybe if you want to pull out a couple of the comments, some have been answered in the chat, but any further technical comments that people would like to raise first?
Thanks, Carter. Yeah, there were a couple of themes in the chat, and I appreciate that some of them are getting answered as we go. But I'm going to back up to Shan's talk, the first one we heard today, because there was, I think, we heard a couple times, once in the chat and then also from Alina in her discussion, questions about the groundwater trade relationship. So if I've captured it correctly, first of all, just in general, I think that was surprising for people to hear that global trade seems to be reducing groundwater stress. And then very specifically, one of our participants, Ekpa Oto-Obong, has asked specifically how sensitive is this conclusion um, across locations and settings? What are the limitations of the footprint approach to capturing this? And how might extreme events like droughts alter this? That's a lot of questions. So Shan, I'm going to hand it over to you to perhaps choose, the topic specifically to answer now, and then further discussion can occur in the chat or offline.
Yeah, I think some of the best discussion on this is going to have to be offline. So big caveat here, hydrologist by training. I got a bunch of economists in a room to do this. I'm summarizing some of their findings, so take everything I say now with that caveat. So it is the finding that Alina mentions is quite surprising to me as well. But it does make sense when you think about it. So first off, the finding that on average, we see less groundwater irrigation. And I think I might have misspoken. This is an important distinction. There's tends to be less groundwater irrigation when with more trade openness. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's less groundwater depletion. So there might still be irrigation occurring in those locations that are more prone to depletion. So I might have misspoke there. Generally speaking, the finding is that as much as having an open market may incentivize some locations to produce for export, that tendency is countervailed by when there is less openness, there's a stronger requirement for local economies to produce their own food. And so that effect of increased irrigation in places that may have less water available is on average larger. So that's an average finding. A lot of caveats about how that actually is affected across space and across time. Yes, groundwater irrigation, a lot of this is responding specifically to drought events. I'd like to turn it over to maybe some of the economists in the room. I'm looking at Iman if you want to add any more clarifications to that.
I think you explained it perfectly. But as I mentioned, that Keith Fieldley has been working on productivity implications. And one of the things which is important is that climate change, warming climate, all of these will somehow motivate more irrigation. But on the other hand, more productivity, higher productivity will somehow reduce the pressure. So on the balance, what will happen, it really requires some quantitative framework to capture that and connect that to markets and motivations that is happening. Of course, there are like drying wells around the world. market connection is something that definitely requires some validated work that we have been doing a little bit on that, but there's huge room for improvement in the future. I will stop here.
Right. Raise up.
Yeah, one more. I'd like to jump to a question by Venkatesh D, who said, thanks a lot. Great talks. Can we talk about leakage of conservation scenarios in terms of importance of remote connections, like from India to the EU? I'm not sure which talk this was directed at specifically, or if it's more generally a question, but given that we're talking about conservation scenarios, I'm guessing this might be for Mayra.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, I was thinking about that question and how to respond, but I wasn't quite sure of the specifics. So if the person would like to unmute, I don't know if they are allowed to unmute, but they could do so just to provide a little bit of more context. But in terms of leakage of conservation scenario, in our analysis, we didn't do that. It wasn't the purpose of the analysis that we did. We were really hoping to get most importantly the two products that we got, right? The first one was the global map on the high value freshwater ecosystem, so that that would allow, that was combining, right, the aquatic and the terrestrial part of the ecosystem, the freshwater ecosystem, which is kind of the novelty of our work, is that, and putting that at the hands of governments because they're setting their targets. So because Conservation International is one of the core partners of the Freshwater Challenge, it's not our initiative, it's a country's initiative. 5 countries actually led the creation of this initiative together with us. We have been indicated that the countries are in need of very specific technical resources to start thinking about how to set up their targets. So this was one of the responses that we have for them. And then the second bit of the data was the climate mitigation data, because we do have a well-established climate or carbon market. And this was our attempt to, okay, we can bring some carbon finance here to do restoration. But all that, the aspect of leakage is we do take into consideration as a organization that works with conservation. So to go a little bit on the comment that Carter made about how can we move from global to local, this is precisely what Conservation International does. So this work is specifically for us is going to help guide the spatial planning of our actions on the ground. So for example, in India, we do have a beautiful initiative called Mountains to Mangrove, which is to restore the Eastern Himalayas from source to sea. And we are using this data set that we have on the high value freshwater ecosystems to, as one of the knowledge products that we have, to precisely determine the pixel that we are going to restore on the ground in light of other knowledge products. And we do all that in this particular case of the Mountain to Mangrove in collaboration with our local partners that are actually implementing the conservation on the ground. So there are, all this to say that there are several steps that goes from global to local, and those steps are going to vary depending on where you are in the globe and what the outcomes that you are looking for in each specific place. But we do take into consideration leakage, and we do have safeguards and so on and so forth. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I have one last technical question before we open this up, and this one's for Jonathan Dolman. Our participant Ekpa Oto Obong also asks, I would like to know that given that the model emphasizes predictors such as proximity to existing cropland, climate, and soil characteristics, how might the exclusion of other potentially relevant factors like land tenure, policy restrictions, or market accessibility affect the accuracy of the predicted conversion potential in regions undergoing non-traditional agricultural expansion? That is quite a thoughtful question, so thank you for that. And Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on this?
Question. Yeah, there's a lot behind it, I would say. Uh, so in this specific analysis on the land conversion, we do have specifically taking into account this accessibility, for example, and also protection layers play a role, but only for the current situation, of course. And the model was not built on the global scale, but on the regional scale. So you can also have differences between regions of the importance of certain drivers. So I think to some extent that takes into account how there's differences in processes between regions. So to some extent, showing different processes how land conversion takes place. But of course, there's limitations to these global analyses, right? Country level or local characteristics are usually only taken into account in a very limited way, and land tenure characteristics between countries or at the sub-country level, that's definitely not taken into account. So I would say that's a limitation. I did want to say, and links also a bit to the question before to Myra about this leakage effect and protection effect. I think that's one of the main purposes of the analysis that we do with simple G, with representing all the land use, land cover, and then this protected area representation. That we take into account how land is managed, how protected areas can expand or not, and what the trade-offs can be. So specifically with Simple G, that's the perfect tool to assess these kind of leakage effects. And I think that also relates perhaps to different, and we could assess if we had more good information on the country level, what kind of land management or land tenure characteristics how that could affect other regions, for example. So I think that's what could be a nice way to make use of the capacity of this type of modeling. Hopefully that answers partly the question.
Thank you for that. And Carter, I'll hand it over to you for open floor for the remainder of our time.
Yeah, well, I'd like to, again, go back to the objectives of this session, looking forward. As I said, it's looking at areas of collaboration, some existing gaps, and we got a few ideas. Isha mentioned a couple, but also even maybe perhaps more specifically priorities for future collaborative research. I'm an economist, so, my radar heard quite a few times that the economists are not stepping up yet, that there's a lot of policy issues, a lot of valuation, a lot of perhaps financing issues, Myra, on the cost side. What I'd like to actually maybe put back to the panel members or to Danielle Imam as well. Any of you sort of, where are the economists in this? And do I sense a gap because they're not at the presenters, maybe except for Iman, but is it a real gap? That's sort of part of the next step to get more policy relevance for these global and increasingly local findings. Anyone care to jump in?
I like to start. I believe the economists need to be a little bit more on the leader role in terms of these research questions and related to land, water, and environment. Of course, we are constrained by the available data. We are talking about a model a quantified model. You need data for that. You need a validation, which is extremely difficult when we are talking about economics. And I believe with evolution of some new validation methods that we can talk confidently about the results that we are having in economic models, then there will be a lot of room for application of those. Currently, we are talking with hydrologists or biophysical scientists. They have rigorous validation methods. In economics, it's really hard because we cannot capture all of the policies, all of the changes, all of the behavioral parameters that's governing water and land and agriculture. But I think we can do better in that terms. I agree with that.
Step up. Jonathan, in Europe, you've probably got the best human capital surrounding you in every direction. What is the bridge to some of your governments that you work with?
Good question. It does remind me also of the question that Aline posted, like how do you communicate your results and what to use? And I think one key application that we're putting a lot of effort in now is this nature restoration regulation that we have in Europe. So there's an official law, even though there's quite some leeway in it how it can be interpreted, that nature has to be restored to a healthy level in Europe, and that all ecosystems in all ecosystems in need of restoration need to be improved, so to say. And I think that is for specificity for this land use management database, that can be a bit of a more policy-oriented application. Where we can pinpoint like these locations are intensively used, these are extensively used, and where is the potential to restore nature, how to benefit, and also then the next step there. So that's then based on the current data, and then what we are working on is making this link to economic models to also put this into analysis to see what the trade-offs are with the economic system, with the food system, and how it links up to the rest of the system. And I think there's a lot of interest in that. We have quite some contact with, for example, the DGs, the governments in Brussels of the European Union. There's quite some effort to take this kind of knowledge into account. So that's nice. At the same time, also in Europe, there's headwinds, right, for these kind of policies. So at the same time, there's a lot of interest in food security, the sovereignty of the European food system. So it's not always as easy to bring these kind of messages and to see how that to bridge the gap between science and policy. So that's a continuing challenge, I think, for many of us.
Yeah, just one point from me, because for the specific work that we have, definitely that's a research gap, or not necessarily gap, a subsequent step that we want to take to incorporate more economics into this narrative that we are constructing. So we are open for collaboration, first of all. Second of all, is that we work directly with countries, right? We have this open door as NGOs. We are talking to all these many different countries, working with them. One of the things that I learned, because I'm also a scientist, right? I'm not a policymaker. We have to have the science ready 2 years in advance to helping countries to change anything. So, for example, if we are talking about the freshwater challenge and the fact that we really wanted countries to have freshwater targets by the end of last year, we have had to have the science 2 years prior to that. So even our work already came late to influence the policy at the right time that is needed. So there is a little bit of this challenge that we face when we are generating the science and when it's needed. This particular work was one of the fastest work that I have done to try to address a specific knowledge gap that we needed. But it's something that, going back to what Iman says about the difficulties of having data and the challenges that brings, it's where we try to be creative with the work that we do as conservation organizations. Not saying that we want to cut corners, but we really need to challenge. We try to challenge the scientists to be creative when we are working on this multidisciplinary type of work that is needed to inform policies.
Great. Anyone else want to comment? I'm struck how the climate is seeping in very much into as a factor. You can talk about causality any way you want, but land and water are not, and climate are not independent. They're very much linked. And, for example, the climate shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs, increasingly, Danielle, you told me, are increasingly integrating land use scenarios, which is very important. And sometimes I wonder if, for a lot of governments, if it might be attractive to try to do it the other way around. Land and water are so tangible and so local and so much affecting local welfare, poverty, sustainability, cities because of where the water comes from, that we might even want to start more emphatically with land and water scenarios and then overlay climate. But this is a rich space. I just throw that idea out.
Thank you, Carter. That's, I think, the perfect thought to end on. That we've come around to this topic that we think connects our global challenges right down to the local science, the local policy, and the local data. And this is unfortunately the end of our time. I know we had more questions and could have talked for another hour, but I'd like to thank everyone who spoke, everyone who attended, everyone who asked questions, and remind you that you are always welcome to connect with us through the GLASSNET project, and we hope to hear from you again.
And thank you, panel. It was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great week.
You all.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
John.
Thank you. Bye-bye.